Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to the last of our lectures on Sherman's March to the Sea, which was a program we conducted in February of February of 1996 in Savannah, Georgia, at the Georgia Historical Society. Our last speaker is Mark Grimsley, and I'd like to tell you two stories to set this up. I think you'll find this of interest, and because this is via Blue and Gray's archives, these are things I think ought to be preserved for posterity, and so I'll tell you this story. First, on Mark Grimsley. Mark is a professor of history at The Ohio State University. In the initial efforts of the Blue and Gray, keep in mind that we're only about 2 years old at this time. We're having a hard time. We're not having a hard time getting people speak for us, but we're getting to know the network and who's out there and who's not. And Mark represents a group that I call the Three Musketeers. One of our early discoveries in this were three first-rate historians who were all very young and just getting a good start in their careers. Steve Woodworth was at Toccoa Falls College in Georgia. He would subsequently leave and go on to become professor of history at Texas Christian University in Texas, and has published a significant number of very high quality books, primarily emphasizing the Western theater, which was the core of his doctoral work on Jefferson Davis and his generals, which focused on the Western generals. Then there was Brooks Simpson. Brooks is a genuine quality scholar. He's a professor of history at the Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. And Brooks, his scholarship is superb, perhaps most noteworthy for writing what Ed Bars, to his death, still believes is the finest single volume biography of U.S. Grant that's ever been written. It's called Triumph Over Adversity, and it was the first volume of what was supposed to be a two-volume biography of Grant, but the second volume never got written. However, his work through the Civil War and that biographical sketch just set people on their haunches. And don't worry about some of the others that have recently come out, like Ron Chernow's. If you want the best single biography of U.S. Grant through the war years, it's hands down, it's Triumph Over Adversity by Brooks Simpson. And then the third historian is Mark Grimsley, our speaker here. And Mark, as I mentioned, is a professor of history at The Ohio State University. Mark was perhaps the most eclectic of our Three Musketeers. He was already well established at a very big university with a big reputation. He had some fine mentors there, and Mark has always been a perceptive and insightful historian who probes the boundaries and provides you with what I like to call his brain salad. You don't engage with Mark Grimsley without understanding that Mark is going to make you think about your points. He's not here just to entertain you. And so of the various and sundry books that were written on this campaign, and they were generous and good, the most intriguing to me was the book that Mark had just come out with called The Hard Hand of War. I don't remember who the press was. It could have been Oxford University Press, but the level of the scholarship and the thinking there was such that it earned a high degree of admiration and critical praise. And so to read on The Hard Hand of War was to appreciate that you were really going to have an intellectual workout. I think it very much in line with books like Bill Frayling used to write, who you'll meet in another lecture. But Mark's presentation in there, I've talked about Velcro books and page turners, and Mark's book on the hard hand is more of a Velcro book, but again, not intended in a negative sense. It just means that his scholarship is so profound that he forces you to work, and it's hard to go from page to page because there's so much going on in what he says to you that you have to sit back and relax. You just can't flip one page after another and after 30 minutes have read 10 pages and say, oh, that was wonderful. I think Mark compels you to take the time to do your homework. And so I think that that's a big feature of this and one of the attractions in inviting him here to speak at this event. The other thing, which is kind of a documentary of what Blue and Gray had done, I'm reminded when I saw Mark's name, I'm reminded of an early project we did, which we were tapped and asked by Duke University Department of History if they might send one of their graduate students who was working on her doctoral dissertation and was studying Sherman's march to the sea and then his march through the Carolinas. And they wanted her to have some exposure. She was a woman of Scottish origin, Jackie Campbell, I believe. Jackie Bindman was her name. And then I think, I'm forgetting, I believe her professional name is Dr. Campbell, Jacqueline Campbell. And I think she is now at the University of Connecticut as a professor. But we were quite happy to do that. Duke University just being about 60 miles from Blue and Gray headquarters. And she came down, and the primary reason for her was to get to meet people like Mark and Lee and those people who could help her and help mentor her a bit in her journey through the doctoral dissertation process. As a result of this, Jackie wrote a monograph, a scholarly monograph for us about the relationship between Sherman soldiers and Southern civilians as Sherman marched north, which she then subsequently published the entire study as her first academic book that she published. And we had a very friendly relationship with Jackie for a number of years. We've subsequently kind of gone our own ways just because that's what happens after 20 some odd years. But Jackie did do a monograph for us, as well received. And in appreciation, Duke University gave us an attaboy and was added to our list of locations of great importance, like Georgia Historical Society and Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Duke University campus hosted us and allowed us to do a symposium at Duke that was hosted by the Department of History at Duke University. So this program had a lot of spin-off ramifications to it and led to some very useful relationships later on in Blue and Gray's existence. So it's with very fond memories that I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy Mark Grimsley's presentation, ostensibly on new perspectives on Sherman's March to the Sea. Thank you. Mark Grimsley and men like Mark Grimsley and ladies like Mark Grimsley and Jackie Binman and so forth that are coming forth, the scholarship and the state of scholarship for the Civil War will only get better, and it will become more enriching and more rewarding. And I think that the challenge that they have accepted is remarkable, and I think we can all feel very comfortable knowing that the war will not, in fact, ever be forgotten. Mark Grimsley is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Ohio State University. He specializes in American military history with a research focus on the Civil War. He also has a long-standing interest in the problem of war and moral judgment. His first book, The Hard Hand of War, Union Military Policy Towards Southern Civilians, 1861 to 1865, is published by the Cambridge University Press and was a featured selection of the History Book Club. His current work includes an edited volume of The Collapse of the Confederacy and a study of the Wilderness James Campaign of May to June 1864. Dr. Grimsley received his doctorate from the Ohio State University in 1992. His dissertation was supported by a presidential fellowship from that institution. He also won a dissertation fellowship from the U.S. Center of Military History. He holds a Master of Arts in War Studies from King's College, London, United Kingdom, having studied there in 1984 and 85, and having done a special subject on the ethics of war. Before that, he took his Bachelor of Arts from Ohio State in 1982. In addition to his academic pursuits, Dr. Grimsley has long maintained a commitment to writing history for the non-specialist. His first published work of popular history appeared in Civil War Times Illustrated when he was 20 years old. Since then, he has written 14 other articles for that publication, including 4 full Nathan Bedford Forrest. Dr. Grimsley's interest in the Civil War dates back to a 20-page novel set during the conflict which he wrote at age 10. 2 years later, this interest expanded into a lifelong passion when he read A Stillness at Appomattox by Bruce Catton, an author whose stylistic gifts and quality of insight he still admires. Please join me in welcoming Mark Grimsley.
Thanks, Lynn, for that introduction. And thanks, all of you, for coming out on this trip and coming out this evening. I really enjoyed being down here. It's been a real interesting day. Spend with all of you, and it's been very rewarding already. One of the things that I found while I was over at Fort Jackson, just a couple of hours ago, walking around, and I was looking at some of the plaques and the interpretive markers over there, and I ran across a name that I recognized, the name of Colonel John Flynn, 28th Pennsylvania. Now, Colonel Flynn was the commander of 2 regiments, 2 Union regiments, that occupied Fort Jackson during the days immediately after its occupation by federal troops in December 1864. So most of us have been there today, so we can imagine Colonel Flynn as he sits down in Fort Jackson on the evening of December 28, 1864, and writes his official report about the campaign, March to the Sea, the Savannah campaign that he and the armies have just concluded. And I'm positive that if Colonel John Flynn looked ahead from that date, 131 odd years later, and could see all of you here this evening who have come and spent money and time and energy and effort just to come and sort of relive and recreate this campaign that Colonel John Flynn and his cohorts had just undergone, he would have been amazed. Because in his official report, one of his main thoughts is that this campaign is, throughout its entire extent, void of interest to the soldier. Nothing much happened as far as Colonel John Flynn is concerned. Nothing much happened. So this comment, I don't know. I think this comment is startling. You find this comment startling?
Yes.
You do? Okay, good. All right. Still I'm nodding head. That's good. That's good. It should be startling. Void of interest to the soldier. Here was the operation, March to the Sea, so often considered to be the dawn of 20th century total war, the desolating march that revived war upon civilians, the normal military tactic, the prototype for strategic air bombardment against national economies. Colonel Flynn, however, clearly had no inkling that he and his men had just passed from one epoch in warfare to another. Instead, he noted that by and large, quoting here, the Army has not had occasion to form for battle. Few bloody fields have been lost or won. No sieges have been commenced and ended, as the enemy has not in one instant made a stand of sufficient length to require the necessity of such measures. As far as the colonel is concerned, the chief measurement of significance, the clash of opposing armies decisively engaged, have been entirely lacking. And what had gone on, foraging, the destruction of war resources and other kinds of things, Colonel Flynn did not regard this as a departure. He didn't regard this as something new in warfare. He regarded it as kind of a continuation of something rather old in warfare. So what I want to do tonight is to talk about the continuities between the march to the sea and what had gone before. And after I've talked about this a bit, one of the things that should become kind of striking is how the march to the sea fits in with these previous practices in Europe and elsewhere, and also how it differs. In one significant respect, it really does differ. Compare with previous experience, what distinguishes the march to the sea is not its severity, but its relative mildness. Those are the continuities with previous practice and the relative mildness. So what I'm going to do is talk about these continuities a bit, and then try to account for this relative mildness, the persistence of restraint, even in the midst of what really was a pretty destructive campaign. And I have, in fact, I'm not denying that it was a destructive campaign. The title of the book is The Hard Hand of War. It's not the slap on the wrist or anything like that. This is clearly a destructive campaign, but compared with what had previously happened, and when you think about what does not happen, what doesn't happen is significant. The March to the Sea has its beginnings, of course, for all practical purposes, in October, when Sherman writes Grant and says, "I propose that we break up the railroad from Chattanooga forward, strike out with our wagons to Milledgeville, Macon, and Savannah. The mere occupation of Georgia," he argued, "was useless given the hostile population. But the utter destruction of its railroads, houses, and people will cripple their military resources. I can make the march and make Georgia howl." What Sherman had in mind was not a departure, not so much a departure in the history of warfare, as a reversion. A reversion, what he had in mind essentially was a new chevauchee. I don't know if this word is terribly familiar to anybody. Anybody know what a chevauchee is? Chevauchee is a French word. It comes from, derives from cheval, horse. And a chevauchee is a military raid. Originally it was a military raid made by mounted troops. The first chevauchées dated back to the 100 Years' War in the 14th century, and were massive raiding expeditions in which the English systematically pillaged or destroyed everything in their path. In its first great raid of that late medieval conflict, the Army of Edward III burned villages, churches, monasteries, hospitals, devastated grain fields, and slaughtered French civilians by the hundreds, and had driven thousands more to the temporary shelter of the walled cities of France, where they went on to perish from disease and famine. Subsequent chevauchées were sometimes on an even larger scale. When conducting these raids, the English army resembled nothing so much as an ambient, marauding city, replete with its own facilities to process what it had plundered. The chronicler Froissart described one such expedition in 1359. I'm going to quote this, and I want you to listen to this and think about Sherman's march to the sea. On this campaign, the great English lords and men of substance took with them tents of various sizes, mills for grinding corn, ovens for baking, forges for shoeing the horses, and all other necessities. To carry this, they had fully 8,000 wagons, each drawn by good, strong roundies, which they had brought over from England. They also carried on the wagons a small number of boats. Each of these boats could take 3 men over the biggest lake or pond to fish, whatever part of it they liked. Not only were they plundering from the land, they were plundering from the ponds and lakes as well. The army, the English army, was always divided into 3 bodies, each moving independently with its own vanguard and rear guard, halting for the night 3 miles behind the preceding one. They kept this formation the whole way from Calais until they reached the city of Chartres, a distance of nearly 200 miles, just slightly less than the distance that Sherman's men covered from Atlanta to Savannah. Now, although chevauchés of the 100 Years' War provided sustenance for the men, and the plunder gave them a motive for fighting, the chief strategic purpose of the chevauchés was frequently political and psychological. They demoralized the hostile peasantry and punished a subjugated one. They also undermined the authority of the French crown. As in 1346, when Edward III conducted an extensive raid, burning, laying waste, and driving out the inhabitants until, in the words of the chronicler Froissart, the French were full of sorrow and exclaimed, "Where is Philip, our king?" The logic at work here exactly anticipated part of Sherman's rationale for his march to the sea. This is Sherman again. We can march a well-appointed army right through his territory. It is a demonstration to the world, foreign and domestic, that we have a power which Confederate President Jefferson Davis cannot resist. This may not be war, but rather statesmanship. Nevertheless, it is overwhelming in my mind that thousands of people abroad and in the South who reason thus. The North can march an army right to the South. It is proof positive that the North can prevail. And in effect, if Edward III was trying to make the French peasants cry out in sorrow and ask, "Where is Philip, our king?" Sherman was trying to get the citizens of Georgia and the larger South to cry out, was in effect, "Where is Jefferson Davis, our president? Why can't our government protect him?" 100 Years of War, Civil War, same purpose, same intent is there. But of course, Sherman's purpose was not entirely political or psychological. And in an important sense, what Sherman was principally engaged in trying to do was simply to get from point A to point B. He discovered that Atlanta could no longer be held and still permit him to muster the appropriate offensive punch to continue farther into Georgia or farther into the Deep South. He was dangling at the end of a 150-mile supply line that led back to Nashville, and from there back north of the Ohio River. And what he really needed to do urgently was to cut loose from the old supply line and move to a new one along the coast. This, of necessity, required him to abandon the supply line entirely, to live off the countryside during the 2 or 3 weeks that it was going to take to move the 220 miles from Atlanta to Savannah. And once he did this, he was right back in the same situation as armies had been in early modern Europe, 16th and 17th century. He was back in a position where the logistical imperative, the need to keep his troops fed and so forth, obliged him to live off the countryside, just as these early modern European armies had to do. These armies of early modern Europe, I'm talking about the armies of the 16th and 17th centuries, had lacked systems of regularized supply. They depended on foraging to survive, particularly within the field. And the constant need to live off the land often exerted near dictatorial control over strategy. A lot of times, generals in the early modern era would invade a particular region, not so much because there was any particular strategic point to it directly, but they would try to invent a strategic point because they knew they had to go in that direction anyway, because that's where the crops and the livestock and so forth were. That was where the best foraging was. Now, foraging, under the best of conditions, was an unpleasant experience for the civilians that were in the town. I mean, it is at best an unpleasant business to have somebody march up and take your crops and take your livestock, even a portion of it. Theoretically, the commander might intend simply to revictual his forces and move right on, and he might not have any greater intent than that. He might not intend any greater harm to the civilians than that. But in practice, his soldiers would not be gentle about it, and would frequently contribute their own gratuitous thefts, rapes, assaults, murders. The practice of living off the land had a negative corollary. If it made sense for an army to resupply itself, to revictual itself from the region through which it passed, also made sense to deny that opportunity to the enemy. The result was scorched earth operations, sometimes inflicted as a defensive tactic on one's own territory, but sometimes extended to enemy or even neutral territory as well. Such operations were much harder on the civilians than simple foraging. Since time was frequently of the essence, the denial of supplies to the enemy had to be complete, the resort was to burn and destroy. When that occurred, civilian populations sometimes literally faced starvation, particularly during the early modern era when peasantry generally lived at bare subsistence levels to begin with. Foraging and area denial were in themselves so harsh that they had an intrinsic psychological effect. During the Middle Ages, peasants and townsmen were demoralized by repeated depredations, sometimes revolted against lords that could not protect them. Since extensive foraging and area denial operations could produce significant dislocations in the enemy camp, after a while many commanders, long before Sherman, realized that it made good sense, admittedly reptilian good sense, amplify the effects of foraging and destruction as much as possible, and so increase the psychological effect, the psychological pressure on civilians. The chevauchés are one example of this. Similar operations liberally punctuated the Dutch revolt in the 30 Years' War. Destructive expeditions even took place after the return to relative order that marked the period after the Treaty of Westphalia, after the 30 Years' War. We often think of the 18th century as an era of limited war, in which private armies, approach the field and battle one another, and so you fire first, no, this kind of thing, an era of chivalry. But even during this period, armies often found themselves having to live off the land, foraging. It's tough being a civilian during wartime, even in the 18th century era of limited war. I'll give you one example of this. In 1704, the British commander Marlborough conducted an 18th century chevauchée in an effort to destroy the country and oblige the Elector of Bavaria, one way or the other, to compliance. Marlborough wrote. And his soldiers then razed some 400 villages to the ground, lock, stock, and barrel. Now, what does all this have, sort of reaching back to the chevauchés in the early modern European period, have to do with the Civil War? I mean, aside from kind of the intellectual exercise and saying that Sherman didn't invent it and it goes back much farther, why is this relevant? Well, the answer lies really in two related points. The first is that the same logistical imperatives that compelled the armies of early modern Europe to live off the land compelled Sherman to do the same thing. The same logistical imperatives still apply. This was still a continuity in war even after this time. And secondly, the laws and usages of war under which Civil War commanders operated reflected those same logistical imperatives. People who say that Sherman cast aside all restraint and broke the laws of war and this kind of thing are just wrong. if you look at the laws and customs of war as they applied at the time, he didn't. If you look at, for instance, Emmerich de Vattel's Law of Nations, which is a standard work on the subject, or Henry Halleck's work on international law, or Lieber's Code, General Orders Number 100, which is the official federal guidelines for pursuing the Civil War conflicts for some civilians. Lieber's Code relied very heavily on Vattel. All of them, though, understood and provided guidelines for armies that were obliged to live off the land in the field. Now, Vattel, who was the Swiss jurist who wrote in the 18th century, was tremendously influential. Everybody cited him in the 19th century. Vattel believed that it was important, when possible, to minimize the logistical burden of war and the burdens of war in general on non-combatants. Nevertheless, these laws and uses of war did permit massive foraging and scorched earth operations when necessary, and draconian measures to put down civilian uprisings when they occurred. The crucial requirement was, of course, military necessity. But while that plea created a potentially gigantic breach in the whole edifice of non-combatant immunity, it was neither naive on the part of Vattel nor cynical on the part of commanders to exploit it. Vattel and his generation took seriously the idea that if they expected statesmen and field commanders to embrace their work that was really aimed at trying to minimize and mitigate the brutal effects of war, they had to provide commanders and statesmen with rules that would allow these commanders and statesmen to function within the rules and still have a shot at winning, still be able to win. These were realistic rules that took into account the realities of campaigning. Operating within this framework, Vattel and others were bound to incorporate actual European experience into their work, particularly the recognition of this logistical imperative, that armies must find ways to supply themselves and by extension to deny supplies to the enemy. It's this imperative, more than any other factor, that gave rise to the hard war measures of the Civil War, of which the March of the Sea is only the most famous example. There are plenty of others. That is one reason why Colonel John Flynn, and more to the point, Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan, did not regard the hard war operations of 1864-65 as innovations in any important sense of the term. They might have preferred at the outset of the war to win the war with a minimum of damage to civilian property. When military necessity prodded them to seize goods from southern farmers and destroy southern railroads and factories, they scarcely had to create a new paradigm of war. All they had to do was to invoke the letter of the established laws and usages of war, laws and usages adapted on the whole, very well adapted to the realities of the Civil War, the war in the mid-19th century. The question remains, however, at least to me it's a question, I think it's an important one. Why, if Sherman unleashed a new chevauchée, why if the campaign in Georgia and later on in the Carolinas was so destructive, and it was, destructive of railroads, destructive of cotton gins, destructive of crops, livestock in some instances, some private dwellings destroyed, and so forth. Why did it end there? Why don't we see assaults on civilians? Why don't we see lots of murders? Why don't we see lots of rapes? When we look at the experience of early modern Europe, we sure see all these things in abundance. Why don't we see these in Georgia? And even in the Carolinas, which is a lot worse than anything that happened in Georgia, why don't we see these kinds of things in South Carolina as well? Why did Union soldiers continue to exercise restraint? The notion that they were part of a more chivalrous age won't suffice. Certainly what had gone before was far from benign. One hallmark of modern total war has been the erosion of non-combatant immunity. We need to recognize that barrier, the attacking non-combatants had acquired sustenance barely a century before the guns spoke at Fort Sumter. We also need to be aware that American troops, American militia and so forth, have shown few compunctions about lethally attacking Native Americans. About the same time that Sherman was making his march to the sea, Colonel Chivington in the 3rd Colorado, massacring Cheyenne and Arapaho at Sand Creek in Colorado. In the years following, the U.S. Army would fight a fairly bloody war against the Filipinos. In our own century, we've seen Americans resort to precision bombing, atomic bombing, and so forth. So why? You say this in a more chivalrous age and say there's something special about Americans, won't watch. Why? Why this restraint? Any explanation has to begin with the fact, and I hope there are no sons of Confederation, sons of veterans sneaking around. Any consideration of this persistent restraint has to take into account, first and foremost, that the federal government, from the beginning of the war, intended that restraint was to be exercised. In war, as Sherman loved to remind Southerners and his own officers and so forth, in war, turn to the laws and customs of war, there are really sort of two main strands of tradition. There are the laws and customs of war as they apply to an enemy nation, in which the nation or your enemy has belligerent rights, and the civilians, you can take crops from them, and you can take their property and so forth, but the enemy civilians have a right to their lives. And then there was a strand called the insurrectionary principle, which are dealing with insurgents, which are dealing with traitors, and in which under the international laws and customs of war, you can do anything. Almost literally anything. Imprisonment, exile, summary execution, confiscation of property without recompense. Under the insurrectionary principle, you can do all these things. As far as the Union was concerned, as far as the federal government was concerned, in a legal sense, it was clear that there was no Confederacy. Ergo, there were no Confederate civilians. All there were civilians that were supporting an insurgency. All there were so many millions of traitors in the South, to put it. And yet, the federal government, for reasons of policy, reasons that seemed good to it, decided to treat the Confederate States of America, nevertheless, as if it were a belligerent power, and to conduct civil war, by and large, as if it were a contest with two different nations. And that right away, by extension, gave Southern civilians a measure of protection that they would not otherwise have even begun to. And on top of that, for reasons of policy, for a long time the federal government conducted the war and made deliberate attempts to protect Southern civilians and their constitutional rights, protect their right to property, and so forth, even guarded their property for a considerable period of time. The federal government eventually moved away from this policy, and yet still the federal government intends restraint to be exercised. It never moves over to the insurrectionary principle. Field commanders, too, reinforced through an endless stream of general orders that forbade pillaging and wanton destruction this distinction. People who read these orders and so forth and think, well, gosh, they're seeing these orders, it must be because federal soldiers are committing depredations and doing unauthorized burning and so forth. Miss the crucial point. By issuing these kinds of orders, by throwing their moral and their moral authority, their military authority, squarely behind the preservation of restraint, they help to keep their soldiers from committing more depredations than soldiers already do. Consider, for example, what if field commanders had given other kinds of orders. Burn and pillage at will. Southern civilians have no rights that you're bound to respect. Anything goes. In war, nothing undercuts the claims of personal conscience. Even if you're a Union soldier, you've got this kind of order, that kind of stuff. And if personally revolts you. In war, nothing undercuts the claims of personal conscience any faster than the demands of public authority. Syllogism in Shakespeare's Henry V, "This cause be wrong, our obedience to the king wipes the crime of it out of us," is a long and melancholy history. Many soldiers, decent in themselves, have willingly performed the most sickening tasks in the name of duty. By insisting on proper conduct against Southern civilians, Union generals encouraged rather than corroded the better angels of their soldiers' nature. The persistence of morality in Union soldiers forms the second element when we're trying to explain the persistence of restraint. There's a book, it's a great book, and very insightful, by Gerald F. Linderman, called Battle Courage, the Experience of Combat in Civil War, that argues that over a period of time, Civil War soldiers became coarsened and brutalized by their constant exposure to danger and combat and hardships of war and the death of their comrades and so forth. My research really didn't bear that out. I expected to find something like that early on, and what struck me more was that this did not occur. That even relatively late in the war, Union soldiers still seemed to be animated by fairly good standards of personal morality. And what they were interested in, and remained interested in, even before the end of the war, was justice. A strong sense of moral justice, a strong sense of moral retribution that flows through their letters and diaries all the way through. And this consideration about justice, I think, is important. Because sometimes, as in South Carolina, Union soldiers would go in, take plantations apart, burn towns. I don't think anybody wept greatly over the destruction of Columbia, but that's because that particular state was considered to be filled from one end to the other with the most virulent, the most die-hard secessions. But in general, Union soldiers believed that the Southern population, Southern white population, contained at least three different kinds of civility. Outright secessionists, to be sure, but there were also people who were sort of neutral or passive, and they knew that there were a large number of Southern Unions. And indeed, we know in retrospect that about 100,000 white Southerners wore the Union blue, as well, of course, as hundreds of thousands of African American Southerners. And what Union soldiers then were interested in, sort of justice and sort of retribution, was that it fall on the guilty. And usually only in rough proportion to the extent of their sins. Let me give you an example of this. And this is not from Georgia, it's from West Virginia, but it gives a concrete illustration of the dynamic that I'm talking about. Faced with much guerrilla activity in his district in West Virginia, and an order from that hero of all Virginians, Major General David Hunter, to destroy the houses and areas in which guerrilla activity had occurred, a Union major demurred, nevertheless, refused to do it. And he wrote in defense of his decision, "To men who have taken the oath of allegiance, unless charges be made and sustained, I do not feel authorized to apply General Hunter's order. I would not hesitate to do it, but it is an important and serious matter and should not be done hastily or in the wrong place. I would rather spare two secession than burn up one Union man's property." The persistence of morality, amongst others. The third explanatory feature was the similarity of white Southerners to their northern counterparts. It is always easier to be humane, and claims of morality are always stronger when one can see the enemy's human face. Despite regional idiosyncrasies, Union soldiers and civilians, Southern civilians share the same language, the same heritage, much the same culture. Comments of federal soldiers and white Southerners often note oddities and differences, but it is misleading to suggest that these indicate the personalization of the enemy. Far from depicting an alien people, soldiers' descriptions of Southern civilians often brought enemy civilians vividly to life. Many soldiers empathized with the plight of Southern civilians, even when they approved of the stern measures against them, of Sherman's evacuation order in Atlanta in September 1864. An Ohio Army soldier wrote his wife, seems very hard, it serves them right. Most of the women of the South are generally stronger to sex than the men. Such sentiments did not prevent him, however, from asking his wife in the very next sentence, how would you like to be made to leave your home with your family and have to find a new home? The Southern whites, out of all Southerners, who least resembled Union soldiers were the poor whites. And when we read letters and diaries of Union soldiers, their comments on the poor whites are most unflattering. One thing that particularly disturbed Union soldiers, for instance, was to notice that a lot of poor white women chewed tobacco, spat tobacco, and so forth. This was kind of repulsive. The condition of the poor whites reflected less an alien breed, as far as they were concerned, than the degenerate effects of a slave-holding aristocracy. Pennsylvania cavalrymen serving in Northern Virginia opined that the South contained only two kinds of residents. The one are the mansions of the wealthy, he wrote, generally fine and elegant. Others are the huts of the poorer classes and slaves, which are wretched housing. The neat little home of the Northern laborer is nowhere to be found in the South. Another soldier wrote, the poor classes are all loyal, or would be if they dared, but they are really more enslaved than the Negroes. Such observations introduce the final component that helps to explain the persistence of restraint. Union soldiers' political awareness, political sensitivity. Lincoln maintained they were thinking bayonets, product of universal white male suffrage, stump speeches, torchlight political rallies, and unabashedly partisan newspapers. In short, members of one of the most politically aware societies on the planet. They debated politics around the campfire and in letters home. Not content with that, a considerable number bombarded local newspapers with their opinions on the political questions of the war. They rejected the earlier conciliatory policy of guarding property, preserving constitutional rights, and not touching slavery because it did not accord with their views about what was really needed to win the war and crush the rebellion. But by and large, they observed the distinctions, not only between combatants and non-combatants, but also between unionists, passive, and secessionist civilians, because such distinctions made political as well as moral sense to them. So to get back to the question of, or to revert for a moment to the early modern Europe and the 100 Years' War, and chevauchés, one might well say the America of 1864, 1865 witnessed a new chevauchée. One, in some ways, as systematic as anything Europe had seen, but also more enlightened, because it was conducted not by brutes, but by men from good families, with strong moral values that stayed their hands as often as they impelled a sense of retribution. But for that, federal policy of a directed severity against Southern civilians in the South would not have been possible. But for that, we might well be talking about a march to the sea that conformed in reality to what Southerners remember in mythology. A march characterized by widespread assaults, widespread rape, wholesale arson, wholesale murder. We don't have that. In that sense, we owe tremendous debt to the Union soldiers and the persistence of restraint, even in the culture of war. Thanks very much.
Study when I came.
So much more emphasis on Sherman's march to the sea than Sheridan's similar orders in the Shenandoah Valley. I just really don't understand that. People don't even know that Sheridan did anything in the Shenandoah Valley, but they'll just beat poor Sherman to death.
The people, excuse me, but the people in the valley did.
Yeah, if there was one constituency that recalled Sheridan's activities in the Shenandoah Valley, it was the people who lived, and I suppose people who've seen Shenandoah, with Jimmy Stewart. But in answer to your question, I'm not sure, and I can only guess. And my guessing is going to be that, first of all, what made the biggest headlines at the time, what made the biggest splash, was not Sheridan's destructive operations. It consumed a few days after his victories at 3rd Winchester and Bishop's Hill. And then it wasn't the raising it wasn't the destruction that made the impression. It was those military victories, and then above all, the victory at Cedar Creek, October 19th. And then most people who haven't heard of the raising of the Shenandoah Valley have heard of Sheridan's glorious ride, in the afternoon of that battle and so forth. So I think that made the biggest headlines and the biggest splash. And so that's one of the reasons that's where they remember from the Shenandoah Valley. Conversely, with Sherman's March to the Sea, from the time that Sherman left Atlanta, cut his telegraph wires and then headed on out. And the North knew that he was on his way somewhere. They didn't know where, and they waited for 2 or 3 weeks or whatever before they got the next word about him. All they heard was just reports from Southern newspapers. Nothing just created a sense of anticipation and so forth. Then when he arrives on the coast, it's sort of boom, it's a big deal. He's across the state of Georgia and so on. I don't think it hurt either that a federal POW at the time wrote a song that became very famous in Marching Through Georgia. The one that you can sing everywhere except in Georgia to this day. I think that may have had something to do with it too. That's my explanation. Does anybody else have a... Yeah.
Sheridan, when he went into the Shenandoah Valley, was dealing with guerrillas. And it was different. Sherman did not have to deal with guerrillas to any extent. The whole Shenandoah Valley was all guerrillas. And Sheridan was fighting ghosts and couldn't find them. The only way he could find them was started burning down their source of supplies. And that's what he did.
Yeah, it's true that there's that component to it. Some of the destruction Sheridan was asked to carry out was the fact of eliminating breadbasket. Some of it, like the operations that were conducted in November of 1864, a little bit after this, were conducted with a view toward really trying to eliminate an area in which Mosley's troops could operate. Some of the destruction that occurred around Harrisonburg, understand, so with the middle part of the Shenandoah Valley, was with a view toward retaliation for guerrilla activity. And in fact, that's the one thing that's in Sherman's orders about destroying private dwellings. The only time that could be done would be in instances of guerrilla activity. What he's trying to do is to keep that down. And in a sense then, if Sherman's troops had gone through the way that the mythology claimed and burned every house and burned just everything anyhow, it would have completely nullified any kind of deterrent effect that the threat to burn houses and the guerrilla activity material on it would have exerted. In other words, if the federal soldiers had gone ahead and burned everything anyway, there would have been no disincentive for guerrilla activity. Yeah.
I think possibly, too, it might be an issue of focus. With the combat in the Shenandoah Valley, the tendency is to focus on the battles. With Sherman, there were no particular battles to focus on, so that people focused on his other activities.
That's right. It's very true. And one of the things that I was curious about as I went through newspapers and the Army and Navy Journal and so forth afterward was, to get a sense of whether anybody realized or picked up on the significance of what Sherman had done, the psychological impact, or the economic warfare that he was carrying out and so on. And by and large, they really didn't. What they kept picking up on, what they kept harping on was every battle, every kind of conventional military engagement. These things really weigh more heavily in the scale. So you're right. They had March to the Sea. They had nothing else to really pick up on. So the drama of this great march with Sheridan, they had these conventional things that they've been taught to do for significant. These decisive battles against those forces. Yes.
You said that there were about 100,000 Southerners that fought the Union Army. Maybe is that common knowledge and well documented? I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
That seems like a book right there.
A book's been written. I didn't write it, but a book has been written. It's called Lincoln's Loyalists. It's by Richard Nelson Current, and it was published, I think, in 1991, and it's still around. So,
are they more from border states? How did Georgia?
Every Confederate state except South Carolina provided soldiers for the Union.
That's right. And or provided organized units for the Union. Probably some South Carolinians
Georgians do. I think they were mostly from around the mountainous area. They were the western part of the Confederate States. They tend to be along the Appalachians, whether it's Georgians, South Carolinians, North Carolinians, Tennessee. They tend to be people who had no stake at all in slavery and such.
That's right. I think almost 40,000 were from Tennessee, mostly in East Tennessee. Another 30,000 are from Virginia, mostly Western Virginia. And then the percentages from all the other states are much, much more modest. I think from Georgia, I want to say it's 7,000. From North Carolina, I know it's 5,000. And so on. Yeah.
Can I put in something that might interest you along that line? Tennessee had 30,000 units, over 60,000 Confederate. Tennessee, I believe, had 5 Union generals, and of the 5, if I'm not mistaken, either 3 or 4 of those 5 were slaveholders. So we're not people from the mountains in any means. It's very hard to generalize in this work that Todd Gross has done on East Tennessee Confederates. But anyway, he took the number of slaves held, the amount of land held, this, that, and the other, and to make a comparison and contrast there, you know what he found? They were almost identical. And it blew up that generalization. And it makes quite an interesting phenomenon, man. And it's,
As far as you look around the world, you'll find that Highlanders, nothing like the lowlanders here, you go to Scotland, you go to Spain, there's no slavery involved, but you still think it's one of the things that falls to the farm. That's what came all over.
Just going back to the original question, I think it's just a very good point. It seems to me that maybe the key to the whole thing, why Sherman was not viewed as the same man as the Shermans is, it may be a matter of location. That Sheridan's activity wasn't being part of the combat that was going on in the Shenandoah Valley, and it was still seen as being part of that continuing war that had been going on for so long. Whereas Sherman, makes that point to marching army to show that the Confederates used a hollow shell, it may very well be the shock, too, of the fact that a Union general is able to move an army through literally the heart of the Confederacy, the center, rather than the fringes. And I don't know, but it may be.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it's kind of a corollary. I mean, in Virginia, what dominates public attention is the duel still going on between Grant and Lee.
Yeah.
And then what Sherman's doing is in a different, an entirely different theater of view that's entirely separate. Someone, do you have a thing on that?
there's an incident that I don't have a lot of facts on. The Roswell, Georgia mill that was shipped north and kicked off the road. Do you have the facts on that?
I'm familiar with this episode, but I bet you somebody here has got the facts on better than I do. When I called Ed, police officer in the town of Roswell, conducted a 10-year study on February 7th, published a book called Charge. Following no more progression to where we go in Kentucky, where there were 7 female prisons, and also follows the federal operations on Tell us, are people familiar with the story, the Roswell story? Do you know what Lauren can tell me?
I'm from that area, so
okay.
I know it very well. Basically, as Sherman was approaching the Chattahoochee River, against Johnson's river line, didn't want to attack it frontally, and so looked both ways on the river, across it, and the nearest bridge in Roswell was at Roswell. People well knew there were mills in Roswell, but did not know they were still operating. He sent his cavalry, Aaron Gerard, to Roswell. They skirmished with the Roswell Battalion and the 9th Tennessee Cavalry Battalion all the way there. Roswell Battalion is a 75-man mill worker, home guard. They were treated through town, burned the bridge, and the federal government found mills still operating. Mill workers there, the machinery all still there running. And with a French flag flying, and as a symbol of neutrality. The owners had fled. The King family had told the mill workers to look after the mill and then just went to make it. And so the mill workers attempted to, Jurgen Weaver is a Frenchman, and the CSI was saved the mill for one day. Sam Gerard went, found CSA being woven into the cloth and said, you're not neutral in order for the mill to burn. They cleared the mill and burned them. Some of the mill workers refused to leave, and so they had to be forced out by the guard. And however, some of the mill workers went back and helped them burn the mill too. And the mill workers sacked the town. It wasn't the Yankees. Federal troops were actually investigating. So basically what occurred then was this incensed Sherman, who never was in Roswell, he was over in Marietta at the time. And he basically, quote, said, if you want to hang the man, you can hang him. If you want to hang him, you can do so. You have my permission, because they never did. They rounded up all the mill workers, charged them with treason for obstructing the military operation, and put them on cars, and basically, to make a long story short, they were kept in a ladies' prison/hospital in Louisville. Some went out to Indiana to find work there. Some very Yankee soldiers on the way up there. And many of the workers came back to town afterwards and helped rebuild the home. So it was long considered a mystery. It was one of those things that Sherman was blamed for. They took all these people away and they never heard from them. And so basically, I'm going to get to that.
One more question. Okay, thank you very much. Different perspectives and so forth. If it confused you, good. If we have helped synthesize and give you something new to think about relative to this operation, even better. What we would like to do to make sure that we don't leave any last little seeds of doubt in your mind, and we fish out your real true beliefs, are to invite our very distinguished panel of speakers to each make just a very short observation on what they think is most enduring memory or thought that they have relative to the March and operations to the sea. And what I'll do is, in no particular order, I just arbitrarily picked an order. If I could ask Roger Durham, Roger, if you'd like to make a comment about the March. You stand or sit, makes no difference.
A comment about the March and Sea. Now, this is almost all encompassing is the mission you gave me to speak on. In looking at the March, one of the things that I found interesting, of course, is to get down to the individual soldier level. And Dr. Grimsley remarked about perhaps the lack of brutality that he thought might be there later in the war, particularly. I think some of these soldiers did possess that brutality, but I think it was a process of long exposure away from the confines of civilization. I've experienced some of that in my own life, and in looking at a lot of the individual people who were subjected to some of this, many of the descriptions that I've come across, I don't think a lot of the motivation was brutality as such. I think it was a means of expressing perhaps outrageous behavior, because the people could not understand how people who spoke the same language had the same commentaries to behave in the manner that these men behaved when they came to some of these places. There are accounts of these men riding up wearing women's dresses, dressed in militia uniforms, dressed very outrageously in clothing that purloined from other plantations. And it was like, how do you talk to someone like that? How do you communicate with someone like that when they're not behaving in a humane, civilized manner? I think there was a lot of psychology in that. The thing I found interesting too is that you do find in that group of outrageous soldiers who are out foraging, perhaps stealing, burning out buildings, perpetrating some of these things. You do find the soldier who can still relate to the fact that this lady and these women of this house somebody's mother, somebody's sister, somebody's wife. And how would I feel if this was happening to my mother, my sister, my wife at home? And every now and then we come across these reminiscences of a soldier, a federal soldier who will come to the aid of some poor woman whose home is being entered and broken into and having soldiers storm into the house and will help that woman. There was a comment made yesterday, I believe, about the foragers, and the one that was caught in the house was hid under the bed. And when the Confederate soldiers came in there, the lady who knew he was there, they asked if the lady wanted to said that they were armed. And she went out her way to help that man because there was that thread of humanity that was there and was not broken in that instance. And I think, to me, that is the one thing that is interesting, that amongst all of that, that behavior that was exhibited, men being threatened with their lives if they didn't turn over a watch or a wallet, a lot of the depredations that were practiced, some of that was due to the long exposure of being away from the confines of civilized behavior. But yet there were those who were willing to come forward and fight that trend in a way and exhibit that human touch and realize that this may be a southern plantation home, this may be some southern soldier's family, but regardless of the fact, they are human beings and they are our former country, and we're willing to take steps to at least alleviate some of that misery that's been practiced.
Mark?
Sure. I guess the principal thought that I have about the Marxist C is that it kind of resonates with what Roger was saying about there are different kinds of behavior that go on. Some of which we admire, some of which we might deplore, some of which simply confuses us, like people, soldiers burlesquing in women's dresses and so forth. What the heck does that mean? And so forth. And it seems to me that as much study as has been given to the March to the Sea and the March to the Carolinas up until this point, what impresses me is how much more really can be done and needs to be done. There's a lot of meaning of different kinds and nuances of meaning. In a way, Sherman's March to the Sea and what goes on the soldier side, the civilian side, and so forth, has a lot to tell us about American culture in the middle of the 19th century. And it's gratifying to see that there are studies underway, and some that have been completed, that really try to get at the cultural meaning of what's going on during this period. One of the things that I think would be nice to see in the future is to place this kind of violence one sees in the Civil War, in the context of 19th century American society more generally. This is a very violent society, just in general. There's a lot of violence going on. Violence toward immigrants, violence toward, for instance, the Mormons. The reason why they line up in Utah is because they're systematically persecuted when they start in upstate New York and even when they move through Ohio and Illinois and whatnot. Tremendous amount of violence directed against the Native Americans, and not just in terms of the Indian Wars, but civilian violence against Native Americans and so forth. So it's a tremendously violent time in American life generally. In fact, I've talked to social historians who basically say that during this period, the mid-19th century, that they can detect an upsurge in violent crimes, violent criminal behavior and so forth, that they're only just beginning to try and come to grips with and try to account for. They can recognize it as a phenomenon, but they're not quite sure what it means. And so it seems to me that there is something here that is begging for attention and begging for further study. We may find at the end of the day that the meaning of Sherman's March can be found not just in terms of military history, the military history of the Civil War, or whatever, but can be placed more in the sort of the cultural history of American life and American society at that time in our history.
I'm
but an old timer when it comes to history of warfare. And it seems to me that it would be valuable to look at this conflict comparison. To begin with, there's a notion that I think is largely a myth that the most terrible wars are the fratricidal wars, where people fight to self. I think actually in terms of death and destruction and savagery, they're the more benign of wars. The plain and simple fact that I think which Professor Grimsley underlined is that the less people talk like us, the less they look like us, the easier it is to kill them, brutalize them, and keep them in another savage way. I would remind you that if you study this question of people and the enemy in a more recent war, World War II, we tried in fact in the Pacific and in Europe, we fought two different wars at different levels, very distinctly different levels of treatment. The Germans buried our dead and marked the grave. We buried their dead and marked the grave. I don't know what the Japanese did with ours, but we buried theirs with bulldozers. And the treatment of prisoners, there weren't. It's simply a different war, because a different confrontation. And the second observation I think we would make is that the peculiar nature of the Civil War was that it was one of the first fought by volunteer, popular arms and volunteers in the 90s. And what impressed me, I think more than anything else perhaps, at the level of violence was that it was very often set by the individual soldiers. I suspect that the few in Sherman's army had ever heard of General Orders 100. Certainly they had never read it. It was lengthy document. And Sherman himself said, I put out orders and orders and orders and keep that. And basically, Mr. Broad literally interpreted this statement. The level of violence is set by the 5 or 10 or 15 men who show up at a house or at a factory and determine what shall be done. Who shall be punished? What shall be destroyed? Sherman himself said of his soldiers that these men think for themselves. That wasn't common. He said they think that they can't make a charge, and so they don't. And officers know the terrain, know that they can. And these guys shouldn't think for themselves, should do what they're told. And they did think for themselves. And I think more than anything else, perhaps as much as anything else, the conduct of individual soldiers in various circumstances determined what happened and the general level of violence. Thank you, my comments. Yeah.
I've been trying to think of something to say, and I'm not so sure what I have to offer. I think Sherman's come out mighty well. And I think Mark has been treated pretty objectively by the historians who've been here. But I began to, I was sitting over there and I paid attention to everything he said. I was scaring myself to death. Maybe it's this place we're in, but if you notice the way these fans are playing and everything, and then all of a sudden it became, this is a spooky place. And the more I began to think about that, I began to have spooky thoughts, and then I was transported back in time a little bit to remind myself, you know, Sherman did open the door and let loose the dogs of war, truly down in this area. And I thought of one night when I was drunk, a good friend of mine who was drunk. And he was an artist, and I always kind of, you know, did it all for artists. And he said, Dan, let's finish this up over in we work in a mining camp, and I got something I want to show you. So I, and we aside for those bunks, and he opened his old locker box, and out of the locker box he put this aside and that aside and the other aside. And you know what was in the bottom of his locker box? He held it up in front of me with a grin. I'll remember to the day I die. It was a necklace made of Japanese teeth. This was his prized trophy he showed me, and suddenly I looked at that man and I realized I was looking in the eyes of someone I did not know. I was 40 years ago, I remind myself, I was on the battlefield of Bentonville, which is getting close to the end of this march, where we were about 40% of the way we got to sit down. And I went around trying to find something about terrain and stories and all, and I made some friends there with some of the local officials, and then I began to go to farmhouses. And I met one old farmer, he took me in and was a little bit suspicious of me, and then we began talking about the battle and all the trenches here and all the trenches there. And he saw I was interested and might do something with it. So he said, he told me, son, would you like to know a little bit more about this battle? I got some bullets and things I picked up. Yeah, I said, sure. You know, like I won't look at another mini ball, but I'm just going to look at it. And he took me out on the back, you know, the porch is right there. We did some washing and washed off that kind of back porch. And he showed me a few artifacts and chunks of shells and everything. And then he looked at me real closely, and I really experienced what I had up in the last thing in mind. He said, let me show you this. And I saw a bar of soap, dirty old soap that was sitting there. And he took the soap and he lifted it up. Said, you know what that is? He said, that's a Yankee skull. I got to say, I can keep it. We opened the doors of war and the hatred, and there was terrible psychic damage done in this area that's never been minimized. You know, the legend is that there was terrible psychic damage done, and a legacy of hate that comes through. And I looked in the eyes of that man, and that's what attracts us in a very spooky way, this phenomenon called war. It repels us and it attracts us, and it scares the hell out of me.
Sherman, I think portions of what everyone has said so far are profound, and I think coming at this point in the order is hard acts to follow. What I have to say, I do not mean as frivolous or slapsticky or even smart alecky, but it's typical. I was sitting here trying to collect my thoughts, and I said, okay, I've got 4 ideas: books, development, religion, and Boy Scouts. One of the most meaningful things that I can remember about Sherman, he passed through one of these places on the march to the sea, and somebody begged him to please not destroy the books in some public repository. He said, far from it. He said, if there were more books down here, we wouldn't have perhaps come to the point that we are now. People need more books, and you need to read more of them. And I'll see to it to send more books down here rather than to burn or destroy any that are here already. Development as human beings, development as fighting forces. Mark Grimsley touches on some extremely interesting ideas about the American character. And I think it's important that we probe for a better understanding of what the American character is, what it may have been, what it may be in the process of becoming. It's very important. Sherman's army was a well-developed army. On the one hand, it was indeed, as has been said, an army of volunteers. But by this point, they were veteran volunteers. And you might ponder the question sometime, what is the difference in combat capability of a well-organized, well-owned, well
well-developed, well-experienced army of volunteers as opposed to a professional army. I think Sherman's army had become a professional army at that point in time. And in fact, Joseph E. Johnston, I think it was, said, "My God, there had not been another army as good as that or like that since the time of Xerxes." It was so well developed, and how that came to be, I think, is an interesting process worth